Hello recruit, and welcome to Astroneer Academy 102, Avoiding the Reprint. In our last course, we introduced you to missions and some basic skills to begin your adventure as an Astroneer. Today, however, we are going to press the pause button on investigating additional missions and, instead, discuss our survival. As we discussed last time, all of our experiences as an Astroneer are taking place inside of a simulation from which we cannot currently escape. I suppose if you're going to be helplessly trapped inside of a training simulation, it helps that the consequences from your mistakes are all less than lethal. Sure, you might encounter some frustration and inconvenience, but at least you're not going to become flora fertilizer. At the outset, I would be remiss if I did not point out that what we will discuss today can be altered somewhat if you are utilizing a custom configuration of the simulation. We will discuss custom simulations much later in our studies in Astroneer Academy 305. Until then, just keep in mind that much of our topic today may not apply if you are in a custom configuration of the simulation. So, what is the reprint? To put it simply, anytime an Astroneer suffocates or endures too much damage, their current body expires and they are reprinted in the nearest shelter or shuttle. It is quite advanced technology if you stop and think about it, especially considering that, at least within this simulation, our bodies are actually just pudding stuffed into a spacesuit. Yeah, the pudding thing again. I promise we will talk about it eventually. It all reminds me of a Doctor Who two-part story, the Rebel Flesh and the Almost People episodes, in which workers control their own doppelgangers who are made out of something called the Flesh. I bet it was just pudding. I'm telling you, someone at Exodynamics must be a huge Doctor Who fan. Anyway. While you do not actually die in this training simulation, you do encounter some unfortunate circumstances each time you experience a reprint. Any items or resources you were carrying in your backpack remain in the backpack that was carried by your now expired body. If you wish to recover any of these items, you will need to locate your previous body and retrieve those items from that backpack. There are some items, which we will discuss in later courses, that can be recalled via the mission log on a landing pad, but for the most part, you will have to venture out and manually retrieve whatever you left behind. Thankfully, you're equipped with a compass that can help guide you to the location of your latest mishap, making recovery much simpler. We will cover the compass more in depth in Astroneer Academy 106, but for now, you can consult the Astroneering Basics portion of the Astropedia to learn how to access your compass. With your compass open, you'll notice a marker that is, unmistakably, indicating the location of where your last lethal encounter occurred. If you happen to have submitted yourself for a reprint nearby, you may be able to spot that marker just by looking around a bit. Navigate to that marker, retrieve your items, and then use what you will learn in the remainder of today's course to avoid reprints in the future. Before we go any further, however, a word of caution. Should you suffocate or sustain too much damage again before retrieving your items from your last body's backpack, you may find the situation becomes a bit more frustrating. You see, the compass will only indicate the location of your most recent demise. Unless you already know for certain exactly where your earlier reprint occurred, you could be in for a long journey as you try to find that location. If you are a particularly clumsy or reckless Astroneer, you might want to get into the habit of carrying a beacon on your backpack so you can still locate it even if you encounter the reprint again before you're able to retrieve your items. Beyond that, there is a strong chance that the simulation will only maintain one copy of a backpack after a reprint. While it does not always happen, Astroneers have frequently observed backpacks that were left behind simply vanishing, scattering their contents into the surrounding area. This can make locating all of the items you are carrying quite difficult, if not nearly impossible. With that cautionary tale out of the way, let's look at the various ways you can wind up being reprinted and how to avoid each one. In our last course, we discussed the need for oxygen and how to create a tether network to supply oxygen and avoid suffocating. Tethers are not the only way to keep your oxygen tank full, however. You can utilize oxygen filters, oxygen tanks, a portable oxygenator, and a helpful friend that you can carry with you. We'll talk more about that friend in Astroneer Academy 204. Working backwards through that list, the portable oxygenator is an item you can craft from a composite resource, and it is carried on your backpack to provide a continuous flow of oxygen provided it receives ample power. Since it is a rather advanced item, we'll discuss it more thoroughly at a later time. Continuing to work backwards through our oxygen-related items, the oxygen tank can be unlocked in the research catalog for 2,000 bytes and is rewarded for completing certain missions. It is printed on your backpack from 1 glass. These oxygen tanks function similar to the oxygen tank on your backpack. The oxygen stored in one of these tanks will be consumed before the oxygen in your main backpack tank, and the gauge on the tank will visibly deplete as you use the oxygen stored within. Each oxygen tank carries the same amount of oxygen as your main backpack oxygen tank, and it is consumed at the same rate. If you were to fill every single slot on your backpack and terrain tool with full oxygen tanks, you could have 16 minutes of oxygen if you're standing around idle. Since we have not yet covered how to produce glass or how you can obtain research bytes to unlock items in the research catalog, a better source of oxygen for our purposes today comes via oxygen filters. These consumable items are already unlocked and ready to be crafted in your backpack printer from 1 resin. Oxygen filters can supply a minimum of 80 seconds of oxygen before they are completely consumed. During its runtime, an oxygen filter will not only provide oxygen to breathe, but it will also refill your backpack oxygen and up to 7 additional oxygen tanks. Conveniently, the oxygen filter stops providing oxygen anytime you're connected to tethers or another oxygen source, or when you remove them from your backpack. This makes oxygen filters an incredibly useful item not only early on in your adventures, but throughout your entire time as an astroneer. Instead of being quite literally tethered to an oxygen network, oxygen filters give you more freedom to explore without worrying about staying close to tethers. Of course, there are some downsides that you will want to be aware of. Namely, oxygen filters are consumable items, and if you are not keeping an eye on them, you may suddenly find yourself out of oxygen and without a resin to create an additional oxygen filter. Additionally, printing items in your backpack does deplete the backpack's power storage. If you start running low on oxygen, but your backpack does not have enough power, you may find yourself as a candidate for a fresh reprint. We will talk more about power and how you can keep your backpack fully charged in Astroneer Academy 104. Moving on from oxygen and avoiding suffocation, we need to talk about incurring damage. You would think a spacesuit filled to the brim with pudding would be able to absorb all but the strongest of impacts, but you would be mistaken. I guess we can chalk that up to the simulation doing its best to create a believable environment. So instead of our pudding-filled suits kind of just smushing and jiggling about after a fall, we wind up taking damage instead. The primary source of that damage occurs from falling, though you may have already observed this damage if you began to suffocate. As you suffocate, the borders around the simulation become red, with the effect growing both larger and stronger in direct correlation to your level of damage. Likewise, if you take fall damage, you will see the red border appear. A short fall with minor damage will have a similarly light red damage effect appear. Larger falls will cause the damage effect to become more pronounced. Thankfully, you will recover from damage fairly quickly, and you will see the damage effect begin to fade. If you take additional damage while that red effect is still present, however, the damage is compounded. Of course, if you incur enough damage in a short period of time, your pudding-filled suit will be unable to endure it, and you'll be subject to reprinting at the nearest shelter or shuttle. It can be fairly easy to receive fall damage as well. Even fairly short falls will inflict a minor bit of damage, and if you have enough short falls in quick succession, you'll be heading for a reprint. I personally have been surprised several times when sliding down a ramp and hitting a small bump that slows me down or brings me to a stop. I suppose an old saying applies in that situation. Speed has never killed anyone. Suddenly becoming stationary, that's what gets you. You'll want to be careful near cliffs and mountains. Keep an eye out for cave openings or random holes that you left behind after digging up resources. Exercise caution around the geothermal vents that you encounter on various planets, as they can launch you into the air. Once you have unlocked them, use caution when traveling with jump jets, jetpacks, and the hoverboard. Oh, and be careful when sliding down ramps. Unsurprisingly, there is yet another way you can suffer potentially lethal damage during the training simulation. Plants. No, the random bits of grass blowing in the wind are not going to harm you. And despite looking incredibly menacing, those creepy spider-leg trees on Calidor are not going to harm you either. There are two broad categories of harmful flora that can inflict damage. They are defensive and offensive plants. Every single one of these plants share a common trait to warn you of their potential danger. Some portion of them will be bright red. Let's quickly take a look at both types of harmful flora and the various species of each. Starting with the defensive flora, pop coral are a ubiquitous plant presence in caves. Left alone, they're completely harmless. But if you dig them up with your terrain tool, they explode. That explosion can be lethal if you're standing too close, so it is a good idea to stand at a distance when digging them up. The bounce vine is a smaller, round green plant with red vines that can be found on the surface of Silva, notably in forest and mountain biomes. When you step on one, it'll launch you into the air. These can be especially dangerous when encountered in mountains, as they can send you plummeting toward your next reprint. Dagger roots are large, whitish, grayish plants, often with a bulbous top, that sport bright red spots. You'll encounter them on Desolo, Aatrox, and in the mantle layer of Silva. If you get too close to a dagger root, it will extend dangerous spikes that can terminate an Astroneer in as little as 2 hits. You can safely stand on top of a dagger root, but use caution when jumping down, ensuring that you're clear of those spikes when you drop down. Wheezeweeds are large, round yellow plants with a red membrane that can be found on Aatrox and Calidor. When you approach them, they produce a wheezing sound, thus giving them their name, and the red membrane puffs up through the hole. If you get too close, the wheezeweed will rapidly puff up and knock you back a good distance. The hit from the wheezeweed itself rarely does damage, but if they knock you down from a cliff or hilltop, you can suffer fall damage. Personally, I think wheezeweeds are just misunderstood. I don't think they're trying to harm you at all. In fact, I think they're simply happy to see you, and that excitement is expressed by its wheezing sound. When you get close enough, the wheezeweed is so happy to see you that it just wants a hug, but lacking arms, it does the only thing it can. It expands rapidly to make contact. They just don't realize the strength of their own hugs, so it's up to you to ensure you won't suffer damage when socializing with the wheezeweed. I try to make it a point to hug every wheezeweed that I encounter. The spine lily is a greenish, yellowish plant with red spikes that appear on the surface of Calidor and Aatrox, often in groups. These will launch you into the air if you step or jump on them, though you can sometimes safely walk across them. You may suffer a bit of damage from being launched, and even more damage when landing if you were launched too high. Visanya and Novus are home to our next 2 defensive flora. The thistle whip has a large, round purple base and a long orange vine with a bulbous end. When you approach a thistle whip, it'll often turn, seemingly to face you, and will begin to shake and produce pollen as a warning. If you move closer, it bends to hit you in a whipping action. That hit alone will induce some damage, but it can also knock you back, presenting the potential for fall damage. Visanya and Novus are also home to the lash leaf, which are a flora with 2 large purple leaves and a pink tongue-like leaf in the middle. If you step on one, it will launch you into the air. You won't always suffer damage from the launch itself, but the lash leaf can launch you quite high, and you are almost guaranteed to encounter fall damage. These can be especially hazardous as they're often camouflaged by the surrounding terrain. They can even grow partially under the terrain, leaving very little of themselves exposed, leading to a hazard that can be very difficult to spot and avoid. The final defensive flora, the lash vine, only appears during very specific limited time events. When active, they can be found on the surface of Silva, Calidor, and Aatrox surrounding Cauldranga. We will talk more about Cauldrangia in Astroneer Academy 401, but should you encounter a lash vine, do be careful. These attack with a whip-like motion similar to the Thistle Whip, but they hit much harder, inflicting more damage and can knock you back a considerable distance. Additionally, the lash vine typically appear in large clusters that include one of the offensive plants that we'll look at in just a moment, the Attactus. And that brings us to the offensive flora, starting with the one that most Astroneers will know more by sound than by sight, the Hispine. This plant can be found in the cave biomes of every planet and come in 3 varieties: normal, vibrant, and dull. When you approach a Hispine, it will release a cloud of glowing acid gas in your direction, emitting its telltale sound when it does so. Normal Hispines inflict the least damage. Dull are the most dangerous and can be immediately lethal. Here's a quick pro tip from Raisins to help you identify the 3 Hispine variants. Normal Hispines emit green gas, Vibrant emits yellow gas, and Dull emits red gas. Given that Hispines can grow on the walls and even sometimes ceiling of caves, keep your eyes and ears open for those distinctive Hispine traits. The Attactus can appear in one of 2 varieties. On Calidor, you will encounter the Spiny Attactus, which fires small, gas-filled projectiles at you. On Aatrox, you will encounter the Volatile Attactus, and these fire a projectile that explodes upon impact. Neither version of the Attactus has particularly good aim, but the explosive qualities of the Volatile Attacti make them especially dangerous, as the blast radius can detonate dynamite and explosive gases. Even if you are not hit directly by the projectile, you could still meet an untimely reprint if other items in the surrounding area explode. Visanya and Novus are home to the Noxious Cataplant, a large purple and pink plant that will launch red, gas-filled projectiles at you. The gas can be quite potent. You do stand a decent chance of escaping to safety if you can move quickly enough after exposure to the gas from one projectile. On Glacio, the Cataplant appears again, often in groups of up to 3, and they take on the form of the Volatile Cataplant. Instead of gas, this variant launches an explosive projectile. With up to 3 of them firing at you at once, an unexpected encounter with this variant of Cataplant can be instantly fatal. And just like the projectiles from Volatile Attacti, the explosion from the Cataplant can detonate and destroy nearby objects and resources. The Boomaloon can be found on the surface and in the caves of Glacio. As you approach a Boomaloon, they will begin to puff up and emit a cloud of gas. If you get too close, they will explode, emitting a large cloud of acid gas. The explosion of itself will inflict damage, and the lingering cloud of acid gas will often be enough to finish you off. Curiously, it can often be difficult to interact with or place objects near a Boomaloon. I suppose they're simply overprotective of their personal space. And finally, on Aatrox, we have our final flora hazards, the Spewflower. These come in 2 varieties as well. The Elegant Spewflower can be found on the surface of Aatrox, while the Noxious Spewflower can be found in the cave biomes of Aatrox. When you approach a Spewflower, they retract their leaves and begin emitting a cloud of acid gas, and will continue doing so until you move away or it has eliminated you from its surroundings. While both variants can be lethal, the gas from the Noxious Spewflower inflicts significantly more damage. With all of these flora hazards waiting to send you back to a shelter for a reprint, you might be wondering how you can deal with them to eliminate their threat. The answer, recruit, lies in your terrain tool. Aim the terrain tool at the base of any of these plants and simply dig out the surrounding soil until the hazard is removed. Thankfully, the terrain tool has sufficient range that will allow you to dig up a hazard from a safe distance. When you dig up the various hazards, they will typically drop seeds that can be planted to grow into a copy of the hazard. Some of these seeds will grow exact copies, but some plants will drop mutant seeds that, when planted, will grow into a full-size plant that is no longer a threat. You can tell that the threat has been removed from these mutant variants because all of the bright red warnings are replaced with a nice, calm, bright blue coloration. We will talk more about seeds in future Astroneer Academy courses 204 and again in 401. Dug-up hazards may also drop research samples that you can interact with to scan or place in a research chamber to obtain bytes, and some may even reveal larger research items that can be placed in a research chamber for even more bytes. We'll talk more about research samples and objects in Astroneer Academy 105. Before we wrap up today, there is one other way you can encounter a reprint that does not require suffocation or sustaining damage. If you return to the main menu of the simulation and select the red icon at the top right, you will see an option labeled Respawn at Starting Shelter. If you select this option, you will receive a warning that you are returning to the starting shelter without your equipment and that this cannot be undone. If you select yes, your current incarnation will be terminated immediately and you will be reprinted at your original starting shelter on Silva. While it may seem like an option of last resort, there are times within the simulation that it can actually be rather handy to be able to return immediately to that starting shelter. But we'll talk more about those scenarios in later courses. Today, you learned that the simulation has a failsafe that will reprint you at the nearest shelter or shuttle should you suffocate or sustain too much damage. You have also learned about objects that can be useful in helping you avoid suffocation while also freeing you from the constraints of a tether network. You have learned that you can sustain damage from falls and hazardous flora, and you have learned how to identify and eliminate all variants of each hazardous flora type. In Astroneer Academy 103, we will investigate expanding the functionality of your terrain tool through various augment attachments, and we will introduce you to all of the natural resources and where to find them. We will also investigate 2 base building modules that can manipulate various resources, and we will introduce you to each of the refined resources. Before that, there will be an Astroneer Academy Quick Bite teaching you how to never suffocate again. Until then, I'm Brandon, reminding you to keep looking to the stars.